when I first, I have friends who live in New York, and so my introduction to Tim Keller and sort of Redeemer Presbyterian Church and City was via my friends who suggested that I contact them. And so I looked up the church website, and it was all a bit busy and overly done and a bit sort of self-conscious, and so I thought. And so I didn't think much of it all, actually, to start with. I then had another friend who went to work in New York, and he went to work with an Anglican church that was started in New York, an Episcopal church, as they're called there. And I said, wow, that's interesting. It's an Episcopal church in New York. And I don't know if you know anything about New York or the Bishop of Newark. His name is John Shelby Spong. John Shelby Spong has an interesting reputation and history and contribution to the work of the gospel in New York. He was the bishop of this area, and I was kind of curious that my friend was going to work for this Anglican church in New York, and he said, it's a Bible-based evangelical church. And what? How do you have it? That doesn't make John Shelby Spong's not going to be helping to start that. And he said, no, Redeemer Presbyterian Church poured hundreds of thousands of dollars into starting Christ Church, Episcopal Church, New York City. And that arrested me, because I'm a little bit involved in Dawson politics and affairs and committees and stuff in Sydney. The idea that Anglican money would go to any 1 cent of it would go to anything non-Anglican is virtually impossible. Like, I mean, partly legally, the trusts are all set up, and they're trust not just TRUST, but TRUSSED. It's all tied up. And this was a mind-blowing experience to sort of connect with and to clock the idea that a kingdom generosity of heart and spirit and wallet could mean that a Presbyterian church would plant an Anglican church in the city. And we'll talk about this in terms of Catholicity of spirit, on the grounds that there were American New York residents who'd grown up in an Episcopal context and who wouldn't attend anything other than a fairly trad liturgical Episcopal service. They would never come to Redeemer Presbyterian Church, and therefore the only way to reach them was to have a really good Episcopal church in New York City, and there wasn't one, and so they said, let's make it happen, let's fund it. And that blew me away, and I thought there is something going on here that is just remarkable and unique and inspiring, and I became, I started listening and then got involved, which is all to say, I think the videos will be free online. Because the thing that I think Redeemer's taught me, and Tim Keller and City has taught me as much as anything else, is that there's almost never a reason not to be kind of try and be kingdom generous, and for crying out loud. Anyway, so Nigel may change that decision, but there you go. I wasn't thinking that we'd charge for these at all. I want to move very. So yeah, they'll be on the City Australia website. I want to move quickly through what I've called here the integrative functions of church, and in particular just briefly focus on justice and mercy and faith and work. So remember I said core functions of the church are the Great Commission, make disciples of all nations, baptizing them and teaching them. So that's evangelism and discipleship. There's no question or qualm about those things. At the same time, what it is to live in a city or a context and to love one's neighbour will mean that these two aspects of church life need to be expressed as well. The first is justice and mercy, and what that means is it's to love your neighbour who is an unhappy, a victim of the culture. So justice and mercy is about loving of one's neighbour for whom the culture around hasn't worked, and they've been squashed by it, or what's happened is that they've found themselves in a situation or circumstance where it's become life crushing, not life enhancing, to live in the culture. For lots of people, most people I think in any given context, the situation they live in, the city, the environment, the suburb, the interaction, the systems, all of that kind of works for them, right? For most people, life works more or less. They get up and they go to work in the morning and they come home and it's not great and it's not terrible, it's just ordinary, it's life, it's ups and it's downs and it's celebrations and it's just life. It works. But for some people, the culture, the way that life has been constructed now, which is very different, of course, from the way life was 500 years ago on this island, which is very different from how it was 2,000 years ago, perhaps. The way life works now just produces people for whom they're a victim. It crushes them, it squashes them, it pushes them down. And so what it is to love one's neighbour, in part at least, means to be involved in justice and mercy. And you can see how this aspect of a church's ministry is also going to integrate with both evangelism and with discipleship. So justice and mercy is not this sort of extra thing in a sense. That's not the point I'm making. It's not this shag on a rock that hangs out over here and that, is an optional extra, the icing on the cake. Justice and mercy is a fundamental way of loving one's neighbour who's been squashed by life. And most often that will mean that it is part and parcel of witness to that person. At the same time, justice and mercy ministries, as they're expressed by Christian people who are out there and actually serving others and getting out of their own comfort zones and putting their abilities and capacities into the game and being stretched in ways that they didn't ever quite imagine, that, like evangelism, service is an incredibly spiritually enriching and growing experience. You don't grow as a Christian by sitting at a dining table and just eating. If you're all diet and no exercise, then you'll become unhealthy. And evangelism and service are like the exercise program of the Christian life. You need the diet program of the Christian life. So diet and exercise makes for healthy bodies, and diet and exercise makes for healthy Christians. But evangelism and service are like the exercise program that needs to go with the diet program of worship and fellowship and so on.
So when I hear you talk about that, particularly around the phrase of loving and serving those who have been crushed by culture, are you saying we need to be perhaps a little bit more selective in terms of who we're ministering to? Maybe we have to kind of get to those who are really broken and marginalised?
I think
Because there's a bunch of people, as you say, we've got the boat, we've got the nice house, and their need for the gospel has actually been pushed away to the side. They obviously need it, but
yeah. And so you'll see that the second half of this is faith and work, which in a sense is the corollary. It's the other arm, if you like, which is to say there are some for whom the culture works. They're in their workplaces and they're doing their jobs and whatever they are, believers or not believers. And the task there is to make sense of that work as having been reconciled to God through Jesus Christ. And so in a sense, I see justice and mercy and faith and work as the church's posture in ministry towards those who are winners in our culture's terms and those who are victims in our culture's terms. You see why I don't want to say losers, right? But it's got to be it's a both. The idea that somehow it's one or the other, I think, then becomes an error. Now, which is funner, right? Which is easier, which is more sort of natural in Australia, and especially in the Anglican context. We are profoundly middle class and overeducated compared to the rest of the population, and so we Anglicans need to, and we've done this sort of sad thing. We have this really great organisation called Anglicare. Anglicare is the social welfare arm of the Anglican Church, but the problem with it is that it's kind of meant that churches themselves have outsourced social programs to this other organisation. The government hasn't helped at all because in order to be allowed to talk to a homeless person, you've got to go through 753 hours of training and then do a risk assessment. And, it's just ridiculous. And so there's all sorts of professionalisation issues that have taken place around helping people. And these are all just the issues to manage. My point is to say Anglicans are a whole lot more comfortable with university-educated professionals than with pretty much anyone else on the planet. And so we need to actually make sure that we lean away from the faith and work stuff, which is maybe in one sense easier, and lean to the justice and mercy stuff, which is not our natural sweet spot. Mind you, that said, integrating faith and work instead of being dualists who think that ministry is good and work is bad is not especially a strong suit for us either. And so the point I'm trying to make is that this question of evangelism and discipleship, and then ministries of justice and mercy on the one hand, to those who are crushed by the systems of our culture, and faith and work, that is to those who manage quite well in the systems of our culture, in order to have a posture towards the world which says, it's not the church in here and the world out there, church is good, world is bad, church is light, world is darkness, we stay here in where it's nice and warm and light, and we don't go out to where there's darkness, other than to yell at those people from time to time and invite them to come into us. That's not the posture of people who get Colossians 1:15-20. If you get Colossians 1:15-20, which says that all things, all people, everyone, everything, every aspect of this society, every corner and every crevice, or as the way that one theologian put it, Abraham Kuyper, fascinating Dutch theologian who in his life was a theologian. He started a printing press, he started a university, and he was the Prime Minister. That's what you call an integrative vision of the Christian life. Right? He was also slightly gifted. And one of Kuyper's favourite phrases is that there is not one square inch in this world over which Jesus Christ does not say, mine. Mine. And when Jesus Christ our Lord says that, then what do? We've got our marching orders. It's his. Every square inch. Every one. And finding ways to grow more and more into being a church that reflects this integrative posture, which is both all about evangelism and discipleship and an engagement with the world at both its darkest and hardest places and its most successful and kind of easiest places, and doing it all in an integrated manner. That's a vision of ministry that I think captures the spirit of Colossians 1:15-20, but more broadly the Lordship of Jesus Christ. That's the vision of ministry that we're seeking to really live out and dwell in a city-to-city context in this, what we call integrative ministry. And the only way that you'll ever have the spiritual capacity to do it, and this is why we started the conference where we started, is the thing that holds it all together is a grace renewal dynamic. That is, it's only as the gospel is constantly, and the gospel of God's grace in Jesus Christ is constantly renewing us and strengthening us and sending us and empowering us and forgiving us and humbling us and emboldening us and giving us confidence and giving us lowliness. It's only as the gospel is doing its work in our heart like that we'll ever have the capacity and the capability and the vision to do this kind of integrative ministry, and in particular, a ministry that's not just about me and my thing. It's really, I think, challenging for pastors, especially if the church is not going so well, that your vision hunkers down. If things are not flying along, the temptation is so hard to avoid to just get more and more focused on how can I get my thing going a little bit better. And it's the grace of God renewing your heart again and again, day after day, assuring you of the forgiveness of your sins, assuring you of that you're loved, assuring you that though you only know the tiniest little bit of the darkness of your own heart, God knows it all and he sees it all and he's still for you and is still your Heavenly Father. Assuring you that Jesus Christ's Lordship is not threatened by the events of the day, that his Lordship is not undermined, that he will be revealed. If you notice how the phrase is that Jesus Christ will be revealed. It's not that he'll be installed. He's been installed. People don't see it, sure, but that doesn't change the fact. He's been installed. He's been enthroned. And that reality will be revealed, and then everyone will see it. And that just gives us a confidence to live and work in our world, whether that's in ministry or in veterinarianing or in plumbing or in being a sparky or in driving trucks or whatever it might be, in a way that all of it is oriented towards and directed towards Jesus Christ. And the task of church leadership is to facilitate the gifts that God's people are to each other in the church in such a way that these things increasingly come to fruition and come into existence and then come into fruition. I find that a thrilling vision of integrative ministry. We, in the church where I'm serving, at that point yet in any kind of full way? No. We're, as my wife constantly says, mainly about me, we're working towards. We're working towards. And that's okay. It's okay to be, but what you can't be is given up or not trying. That's no good. What that relates to then is this final session, and actually I might pause there, see if there are any questions or comments that people want to make about either anything we've talked about thus far this morning in church planting or integrative ministry. I want to kind of wrap it up by moving on to a question which I've a tiny little bit of experience of, but which I'm mostly going to speak about, not from experience, but from reading of the experience of others. I long for and pray that this will become more than theory in my life, but I don't know. But I'll share with you about the idea of a movement in a moment. But anyone, I said I'd leave time for interaction and questions and stuff, so any questions or comments that people want to make at this point? Crystal clarity has descended upon the room, or lunch has descended to your stomachs. Not a single one. I know almost nothing about rural ministry. I know, actually, the only thing I know was when I stayed with a friend who was a pastor in a pretty, not super remote, but relatively remote, small rural town, 500 or 600 people, an hour from anywhere nearby. His comment was, this is what he said about the church. He said, when the farmers do well, they stay away from church. When they do badly, they come to church. And I found that a very challenging comment, especially in a context where in Sydney, people only do well and better, other than people that are really having a hard time. So no, I think the challenges of rural communities are very significant. The movement from rural communities and areas to the city because of increased production and technology changes, which mean that there are, I think, about a tenth of the amount of land under cultivation at the moment by about a tenth of the people that ever used to do it, and we're producing 10 times the amounts of product that we ever used to produce. So you see, you see what's happening, right? That we need far fewer people, there are far fewer jobs, in other words, to be had. At the same time, we're producing 10 times more, so there's much more food around. The calorie production in the world is more than sufficient to feed everyone. Distribution and transportation are the key issues, and corruption, which is why there's still such terrible starvation in some countries. But communities in such flux of enormous job losses and lack of opportunities. It means that families, often kids will leave home either before the end of high school or immediately at the end of high school. It's interesting, my sister-in-law lives not in a rural community but in a kind of regional area, and it just dawned on me, they've got 3 daughters, the oldest of whom is 15, and it just kind of occurred to me that when they finish high school, they'll look to go to university, and that means they will leave home and they'll never live at home again. And so their family, which has been obviously a very intense focus for them for the last few years, they're all, one after the other, 1, 2, 3. They're all about to go, and then there'll be just the 2 of them left. And that's just how their life is. That's the choices they've made by living in a regional context. So other than that rambling and slightly tangential response, I've sadly no experience of rural communities. I'm an extremely boring city, Sydney, born, bred, lived, married, childhood, working, boring person. So, any other questions about complete ignorance that I have? Yep. Yep. Yes, this is one of those moments where I get to do this about one thing only, and this is the thing. I wrote a book. So I wrote a book. It's called Leading People to Christ, and I believe it's on Amazon as a Kindle book. It's designed as a training course for believers. That's both, I was saying before, that gives both confidence and flexibility. So one way you give people confidence is by giving them inflexibility. So I learned EE. Has anyone heard of EE, Evangelism Explosion? EE was just an awesome training tool for nominal American Christians. Brilliant. And any nominal Christians that you meet straight out of Christendom here in New Zealand, you should definitely do EE on. EE consisted of learning a 100-point gospel presentation that including illustrations, that had questions that were leading questions that meant that you could successfully navigate your way through all 100 points after the other. And by the end of the EE training program, you could produce this thing like Pavlov's dogs, right? You know Pavlov's dogs? He would feed his dogs and he'd hit on the side of the tin and the dog would salivate. And then he'd feed his dogs and hit on the tin and the dog would salivate. And eventually, all he needed to do was to hit on the tin. He didn't even need to feed them and they would salivate. And EE is a bit like that. You just hit on the door and then you just produce your saliva. Out it comes. EE, 100 points. So you can give people confidence with something that's not flexible. Or if you give people something that's really just flexible, hey, just learn the gospel of Matthew and Mark and Luke and John and that'll be okay. And just pick out the bit that's necessary at the time. Lots of flexibility, no confidence. And so what I've tried to do in this book is to produce a thing which gives people clarity and confidence and at the same time flexibility to know how in a narrative form to be able to relate what it is that they're hearing from someone else to what is the next thing for them to say or at least ask about. So that's called Leading People to Christ. I recommend you email me and I'll send you it. Yeah.
I've got a friend who's quite intellectual, quite learned, and it's not me, by the way.
Was anyone confused about this?
But I've always wondered, in terms of Christianity and apologetics in the public forum, like how does that interface at a public level? Where is the room for kind of intellectual debate and discussion in this world of kind of PC bollocks?
Yeah, PC bollocks. That's no good.
How do you see that working out
Yeah.
in the public forum and doing that well and still being humble but
Yeah. So, well, it's interesting. I have a friend by the name of John Dixon, who was a founder of a thing called the Centre for Public Christianity in Australia. I think he's about as good at it as anyone in the world at the moment. So if you want to learn how to do public forum apologetics, then a couple of things. He's actually finished up with CPX, or the Centre for Public Christianity, recently. But friend him on Facebook, and you'll see him doing, I think, exceptional public apologetics on Facebook. So I joked before about how Facebook is almost always a monumentally terrible way to engage with people. It's really interesting. John will say quite controversial things in an exceptionally both clear and winsome way, and then engage with 700 comments in a way that is non-antagonistic and at the same time is not weak. So in terms of learning from someone who's doing it about, as I say, as well as I think it's done, in a sort of Australian context at least, John is exceptional. In an American context, of course, Keller is exceptionally exceptional. He did a talk recently in the UK to the UK Parliament or parliamentary breakfast or something like this, Westminster prayer breakfast. Just superb piece of work, superb piece of work. And so I think there are some examples of this sort of public apologetics that we're seeing around the place. And what you can do is you can just, what's interesting about these things is you can not retweet them, but you can share, can't you? If it's on Facebook, you can share it. One of the things I've talked about with John, actually, I've raised with him the possibility that why don't we have an evangelistic an apologetic strategy which goes, you write something each week, and we've lined up 500 pastors that will share it to their 1,000 friends each. And suddenly you've got 500,000 to 1 million people engaged on a particular issue in a really significant, sort of incisive, quality kind of way. That's, I think, about 10 times the number of people that read the Sydney Morning Herald. Pastors don't have friends, but they have Facebook friends. That's what they have instead of friends. So we've all got Facebook friends, and I'm going to pursue that with him. I think that's a really, to have. Here's another version. If it's not just 500 pastors, but if 500 pastors have talked to the people in the churches that they serve and say, here's a really good thing that you could do just once a week, just share this to put conversations out there on the table with your contacts. And so those 500 pastors have got 5,000 people, that's only 10 each, 50,000 people who are also all sharing that with their 2,000 friends. Suddenly you've got once a week something really useful, boom, out there in the society through the social media thing. And that could be I think John is about as good as it gets at the moment. The RZIM, Ravi Zacharias International Ministries, I think okay. They certainly work pretty hard at this. Be great if there was a New Zealand. See, the thing about Australians is that there's an Australian for Australians, Dixon, and there's the American for the Americans. Who's the New Zealander for the New Zealanders? Dixon with an X and Dixon with a K. Figuring this out, but at the moment, John puts something on Facebook, and 500 pastors read it in 5 seconds and then move on. And instead of having a strategic use of this, and partly that's because, and I don't know if you have the same thing here, we have this really great social practice called the tall poppy syndrome. So the tall poppy syndrome, you know the idea, there's a field of poppies, and then there's one that is a bit taller than all the rest, and so what do you do with it? Cut it off at the knees. And so we just love chopping people down. And so Dixon is a tall poppy. He's way ahead of this than all of us. And therefore, the important thing to do is to make sure we cut him down. And so we're working on that. Yeah. So the question is to do with Christian engagement with particularly economic systems, I think, which is what capitalism and socialism are. They're different visions of the way that our oikos, our economics, will work to function to mean that as many people as possible can eat and be clothed and have shelter, which are the core functions that mean that we have to have an economy. If you didn't need to eat, and if you didn't need to clothe yourself, and if you didn't need to protect yourself from the elements, then we wouldn't need to have the production, distribution, and consumption of goods because we wouldn't need them. But that's what an economy is. Economy is the systems by which goods and services are produced, distributed, and consumed. And we have to because we need to eat. We're incredibly inefficient. If you notice how inefficient you are, you need to eat. You need to fuel your incredibly useless body 3 times a day. And most of it goes down the toilet. Right? To get enough energy to keep you going for a day, you have to eat this much stuff, of which this much goes down the toilet, and this much is actually useful. That's how inefficient our bodies are. So we have an economy. And it's a really interesting question as to what a Christian approach to economics is. I think all I want to say at this point is a Christian approach to such matters will almost certainly be inadequately theologically informed if it finds itself being completely politically aligned. So if you land on one side or another entirely, then the chances are that you're being more formed by the politics of the situation than by the theology of the situation. Um, uh, and I think apart from that, uh, all I'd say is that um, what Christians can perhaps most contribute to these discussions is not so much the, new ideas as a new way of debating old ideas. So if Christians can disagree civilly about these matters when they have good in conscience disagreements, both with each other and with other people, if they can find a new way of engaging in dialogue and conversation, instead of the slagging off that basically is what characterises almost all conversations about these things, then that itself will be a significant witness. I myself have views to do with the private ownership of property, which I think is a fundamental economic conviction that comes out of the 8th commandment, actually. So it's embedded in the 10 commandments, and once you own that as a conviction that there is such a thing as theft. The only way there is such a thing as theft is if something belongs to other people and not to me. And once you have the idea of theft and therefore private ownership as a core conviction, that changes a lot of stuff. That you work out the implications of that turns into sends you in a trajectory of economic thought and organisation. I'm thoroughly open to the fact that others have different views, and what I want to make sure is that instead of just yelling at each other, we engage civilly with each other and disagree healthily. And the chances are, if I do that, I'll learn from them and they'll learn from me. So we try and model this in our church life. Once a term, I think I mentioned this, we have a thing called Wine, Cheese and a Conversation about Something and God. Coming up in a little while is Wine, Cheese and a Conversation about Toxic Masculinity and God. We had Wine, Cheese and a Conversation about mental health and God, about asylum seekers and God, about euthanasia and God. And what we seek to do in these occasions is the room is half full with non-believers who come, and every time what matters as much as the content of what we have, and this time we've got 2 experts as well as me. The 2 experts are a boys' school principal and a woman called Melinda Tankard-Rice, who's an author on this area specifically. So we get experts in the field in, as well as myself on the panel. We run a panel. We have contributions as well as then questions. And as important as the insight that's provided is the modelling of a positive, respectful conversation about difficult topics. And so we try and actually bring this as a contribution to our community. We've not quite dared to go into capitalism, socialism yet. I'll see if I can muster the courage sometime in the next year or 2. I think all I'm saying, maybe another way to put that would be to say, these are incredibly interesting and deep issues to face. It's not a simple question one way or the other. And when things are not simple questions, what that does is it means it's important that you hold your convictions strongly and also recognise that for the very reason that these are not simple issues, that you mustn't hold your convictions so strongly that you think that anyone who doesn't have your convictions is an idiot. That's just dumb. You're an idiot if you... Oh, no, sorry.
Just to say, there's the Centre of Theology and Public Issues here at Harvard University.
Okay.
Here, and you can go online and they've got their podcasts and articles and publications available that you don't have to be students there.
Great.
If you want a New Zealand voice on the topic of public theology, there are that.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. Let me then close out our time together with some comments about movement. I think I've experienced 2 kind of micro-movement moments in my life. When I first came to Christ, I was part of a youth group that grew rapidly to 300 or 400 people. And it was one of probably 5 or 10 other youth groups that also grew rapidly in the hundreds. There was, across this little pocket of Sydney, and what's called the North Shore, one of the most privileged kind of areas in Sydney, thousands of teenagers came to Christ in the sort of early to mid 1980s. And that was a really exhilarating experience. There was an enormous boldness about it. There was a real health in lots of what was happening in a place where there was a lot of kind of toxic youth culture around. There were some real pockets of health, including both Christians and non-Christians, just who knew to participate in this, even though they weren't Christians. They just got that this was a place where they were respected and where they were not just ripped off, where it wasn't all darkness. And it was a really interesting experience to be part of. I was a product of, I was a beneficiary of, I came to Christ in the midst of one of these kind of moments of what you might call micro-movement. The second micro-movement moment that I've been a part of was at the University of Sydney. And there was a kind of an explosion just in one period this is the late 80s, early 90s, an explosion of interest in ministry, and in particular in vocational ministry, and dozens and dozens of people from the particular IFES group that we're a part of at the University of Sydney, all in the late, the late 80s, the mid 90s and the late 90s, all went into Christian ministry in different forms or other, and are still now there in 20 or 30 years later. And so those two experiences of micro movements, by micro I mean just really fairly confined, but this kind of experience of growth in the fruitfulness of ministry in a way that was a little bit beyond the control, or certainly beyond the expectations, and beyond the normal experience of these things. It was a wonderful thing. I haven't experienced movement in a macro sense, in a whole city. There have been times of remarkable movement. I know in Australia. I've heard a little bit about in New Zealand. We typically call them something like revivals or renewals, an intensification of God's ordinary work of bringing people to himself and seeing them established and grown in Christ. I know in the Billy Graham Crusades in 1959 in both Melbourne and Sydney, thousands of people came to Christ. The alcohol consumption of each city went down the following year. Can you imagine effecting such renewal in the lives of communities? And as I say alcohol consumption, I don't mean nice, respectable people having a glass of wine with dinner, right? I mean the way that alcohol is actually consumed in our societies, which is with a large number of people having a little bit of alcohol and a small number of people just whose lives are completely wrecked by alcohol. And that went down for the first and only time, as far as I understand, in the entire of Australian history. The amount of alcohol consumed in the society went down one year because of renewal in the society. Likewise, back in those days, of course, having children outside of what they called wedlock, I never really understood why they thought of being wedded as a lock. But anyway, out of wedlock, also children... What's that? Yeah, perhaps. Yes, more trust. Children born out of wedlock also went down in 1960. This remarkable movements of the gospel that took place in those times, which is why when he came out in 59, the thought was, bring him back! Because if it happened last time, it'll happen this time, right? Not quite so. That happened again. I want to talk a little bit about movement dynamics in a church or a network specifically, and then to say something about movement dynamics in a city, and then conclude just by saying a little bit about what City City seeks to bring or contribute to movement in the cities that we're part of. Movement dynamics in a church really consist of three mega factors, and we've looked at two of these so far. The idea of grace renewal dynamics, that's where we started this week, on Thursday, yesterday, where we started yesterday, is with the reality that the only thing that can ever be at the center of a movement of God's Spirit is renewal in the gospel, and in particular the gospel of grace. I'm convinced that the fundamental driver of human life and experience is our hearts. I'm convinced that the fundamental operation of our hearts is to desire or to love. And I referred you to Romans 1:24, which talks about the lusts or the desires of our hearts. wrongly desiring hearts, disordered heart desires is what sin is. Rightly ordered hearts is what righteousness is. So that the fundamental nature of human experience is driven by the heart. Jesus said that. Does the Proverbs say that? What hearts do is desire, and the only thing that will reorder the desires of your hearts in a way that truly reflects God is grace. Nothing else is sufficiently beautiful to you, is sufficiently arresting to you, is sufficiently captivating to you. And it's funny the way that all of these metaphors render us just a little bit passive. When you're captivated by the excellence of God's grace in Jesus Christ, it's almost, the issue is not how excellent is God's grace, it's how open to excellence are you. Are you sufficiently dull that you don't get it, or are you sufficiently awake that you can perceive it? So grace renewal dynamics, which is that constant life process by which our hearts' desires, the loves of our hearts, are reordered towards God in Christ because of his grace towards us. That's got to be at the heart of any movement of the gospel. The only way the gospel becomes a movement is when believers in a context, in a city or a town, are more and more renewed by God's grace, the dunamos, the power, the dynamite of God's grace. That's the first thing. Secondly, the second element of a movement will be a genuine contextualization of the gospel in its culture. And what that means is that if the church is too much or too little like its culture, then there won't be movement dynamics. When the church is too little like its culture, when it's a kind of a holy huddle that's removed from its culture, then it can't impact the culture. But when a church is too like its culture, when it's just kind of trying too hard, when it's become assimilated to its culture, when there's nothing, it's neither, or another way to put this is to say a church needs to be reassuringly similar and intriguingly different at the same time. And if it's all similar and no difference, if it's just a church that's slightly late on the most recent trend, because that's where churches are, right? We're often just 10 years behind social trends. Yeah, reassuringly similar and intriguingly different at the same time. Which is just a slightly clever Keller way of saying in but not of the world. Reassuringly similar, that is, we're not merely weird people who are into this strange thing that have nothing to do with real life. And of course we know why we're not just weird people into a weird thing that has nothing to do with life. We're not like that because we believe that every square inch is a square inch over which Jesus Christ has said mine. And so we don't need to go away from the dark world into the nice light church. There's another reason why we don't go away from the dark world into the nice light church, because not all the light is in the church. There's plenty of darkness in the church, and because of God's common grace, surprise, surprise, guess what? There's some light out there in the world. So if the church is too much or too little like its culture, then there'll never be movement dynamics. We'll either be useless in or useless removed, but we won't be in but not of. So that's where we've parked most of our time, right, over the course of these 2 days, is in grace renewal dynamics and contextualization. But I want to suggest that there's another third, what Keller calls mega factor, that influences the emergence of movement in the life of a church or a network, which is that of an organized organism. The idea of an organized organism is this: everything starts organically. Any endeavor begins organically. So I mentioned my wife has got a side hustle. Side hustle is just this lovely term to refer to the fact that you've got your main job, but then you do something on the side which might give you a breakthrough or not. So she's a veterinarian. Veterinarians have hospital cages and also boarding cages for cats. So that if you go away on a holiday and you don't have someone to mind your house, what happens? and you've got a cat, what do? You take your cat to the cattery or to the vet. And what Katrina's done is she's got invented, or she's put together a new kind of boarding cat cage, which is both high quality and cheap to make. Most cat cages now are either low quality and low price, or high quality and high price, and she's found a way to do something that's high quality for a low price, and is planning to smash straight through that market and completely corner it, and I'm very enthusiastic about this. This will fund City to City for many years to come. It's very organic. She's just out there on her own, just with a business, colleague. There's a vet, and they're sort of trying to think about cat cages, and there's no lawyers involved at the moment. There's no documents. It's just her and a drawing pad. City to City begins because some Dutch people come over to Tim Keller and say, teach us some stuff, and he goes, okay. Everything starts organically and with a free-flowing kind of manner, and then takes on organizational characteristics. And it's really important that things do take on organizational characteristics. If you want to go create manufacture cat cages, then actually you're going to need to establish a company, and that company's got to get a bank account, and the company's got to get registered, and then it's going to have to do tax returns, and it's got to pay its taxes, and then distribute its dividends, and you've got to turn an idea into a thing that actually works and functions in the society. And so everything starts organically as just two people playing guitar. U2, I think, began as four blokes who thought they should make music together, but who weren't very good at playing music. But they just thought they should make music together. And they got in a garage and played some music. That's U2. But U2 doesn't function if there's just four guys in a garage, does it? It turns from being an organism into being organized. And the trajectory of everything that grows, everything that's got substance and life to it, you started as one cell. But within the cell was the information that meant that your incredibly complicated body takes on an astonishing precision of organization, with structure and clarity, bones, skeleton, muscles, brain, organs. And the danger of this process is that things that start out organically become not just an institution, but institutionalized. And that the structure that is there to serve instead becomes the master. And you don't have to think too hard about churches and church life to see that what begins as a vision for reaching the lost and building the saved, and relatedness and relationships and love and grace and gospel, soon turns into committees and budgets and councils and elders and authority and processes and programs. And all of that stuff is important and is meant to serve. But when stuff that's important and is meant to serve becomes instead important and the master, so that it's the tail that's wagging the dog rather than the dog that's wagging the tail, then you end up with a problem. And I wonder whether one way to describe where so often churches are up to, and not just churches, but denominations as well, and denominational structure, is that the necessary institutional elements of churches and denominations can, I think, almost always unintentionally become, instead of servants, rather masters, and as such represent a kind of hardening of the arteries. The elements of an organized organism are such that there is a vision that is a compelling vision of the future based on digestible values, big ideas. That is how the organized organism begins. A really pretty interesting version of this is the 12-step movement. I don't know if you're familiar with the 12-step movement. There is no, as far as I understand, there's no central hierarchy of the 12-step movement that authorizes people to start 12-step programs. It's just individuals who have benefited typically from the 12-step program who begin an AA or an NA program in and around the area. There is a sort of manual of how to do it, but there's no authorizing power that says this has got the stamp of authority and approval and this one doesn't, and you're allowed to, you're ordained. I use that word deliberately. And you're not. It's one of the purest forms of movement that you see. At the same time, part of what makes for organised organism is what I'm going to call here and in the next point as well, a catholicity of spirit, which is to say, in the context of a church or a network, an openness of relationships and communications, and are willing to work with allies even if we don't agree about everything. And you can compare what it's like, what vision is like in an organic context as compared to an institutionalized context. In an institutionalized context, vision ends up having to go through a committee. Vision is taught. In an organic context, vision is caught. Now, are there pure forms of organism and institution? Almost never. But what I want to do is, as we begin thinking along these lines, is to invite you to consider the degree to which what you're a part of has become overly institutionalized. And the reason is that over-institutionalization is almost always at the expense of movement. What was so interesting about the youth group that youth group movement that I was a part of was that the energy and vision for it came almost all from the bottom, not from the top. Thirdly, there's a kind of sacrificial commitment that takes place where people are willing to make sacrifices and are not turf-minded. There's no sort of, that's my job, you stay out, don't you try and talk to my friends, don't you, and so on. And that satisfaction comes from progress towards the vision rather than a salary. And so that the volunteerism is high. In that youth group context, there were people putting in days a week of life and ministry and just wanting more. One of the things that the youth ministers needed to start doing was to help people to make sure they didn't fail their university courses. Because what was happening in the youth ministry was sufficiently exciting that it was actually a little more interesting than Biology 101. And then finally, there's spontaneity and creativity. Ideas come from the grassroots, from everywhere, and not just from the people in power. And so again, you can do a little. I've got some diagrams here, which will be too small for you to actually read. But you could take each of those four dynamics and compare them in a movement context or in an institution context. And the idea there is to be a little bit rigid in pure form, recognizing that nothing is a pure organism and nothing is a pure institution. It'll always be somewhere in the middle. But at least if you have the sort of the sense of what form devotion takes in an institution where, for example, there's little trust, there's lots of meetings, it's very important to make sure that no one has too much power. Because for good reasons, right? Power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely, and therefore we need to make sure that everything gets passed through 6 committees. And no stakeholder is avoided, because stakeholders are very precious. And stakeholders get cranky if they're not consulted. And stakeholders getting cranky when they're not consulted is a classic mark of an institutionalized context. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm saying you need an organized organism. And that's what I mean here by creative tension. You can't have pure organism as life goes on. For example, once you've got vision and catholicity of spirit, but with ideas bubbling up from everywhere, what's likely to happen to the vision? gets diluted, doesn't it? You've got too many people and too many different ideas and all sorts of kind of new thoughts coming in, and people haven't been part of the whole history of it. And so unless you codify the vision at some level, and what does that end up looking like? People writing a vision statement. And the danger of people writing a vision statement is everyone gets to contribute one word to it. So I'm saying this is not a simple thing. It's not like, oh wow, let's have organic communities rather than institutionalized communities. It's easy. It's not easy at all. You can have sacrificial commitment where people are running on fumes for at least 6 months. But after a little while, once someone's paying for them to eat. The uni students, who's paying for these uni students to eat? Their parents. And once they started to move out of home, what happens? Well, they got to get jobs. And they got to turn up to work. And employers love people not turning up to work and still paying them. Not. So they've got to get jobs, and then if they're going to do 2 days or 3 days a week in the youth movement, then they should get paid for that, because the Bible says, right, the labourer deserves her or his wages. And so these elements of vision, a compelling vision of the future, and of an inclusiveness, a wonderful inclusiveness and Catholicity of spirit, and of a sacrificial commitment, and an astonishing kind of creativity and bubbling up of ideas and leadership, these actually are in tension with one another. And movement emerges when the creative tension that's at stake in these elements doesn't lead to this kind of hardening of the arteries into institutionalization, that there's a force that resists that and that retains organic components, organic texture to these issues. I think you see this in the Bible somewhat, actually. How awesome is the church in Corinth? Most gifted church in the New Testament. It's astonishing, isn't it? The number of times Paul says there is no gift that you don't have. No spiritual gift. Does it ever occur to you, how is it that God gives spiritual gifts to such sinful people? Then as soon as you ask that question, you realize, what other kind of people does God ever give gifts to? The Corinthian church, I think, would have been just an awesome church to be next to. Crazy creativity and spontaneity, and those services, you've got prophets standing up and sitting down and standing up and sitting down, and tongues is being spoken, and interpretation of tongues, at least if they did what Paul said, or not if they didn't do what Paul said, and just a massive and at least interest. There's all sorts of stuff happening. They're sleeping with their mother-in-law and they're not having sex with their spouses, and it's really interesting church. You see it in Acts, the kind of this spontaneous, constant, what they almost call gossiping of the gospel. That the church gets scattered out of Jerusalem under persecution, and they just gossip the gospel everywhere. And also, as we saw in for a study this morning with Guna, the appointment of elders. You know what elders do in the New Testament? They rule. Elders who rule well, especially those who labour in teaching and preaching, are to receive double honour, which means they're to get paid. Right? They're to be honoured once, which is to say, thank you, you're really terrific. And then they're to be honoured a second time, which is a paycheck. And so suddenly paycheck now means a bank account, and that means governance by people who are not the people who run the bank account, so that they can oversee the people who run the bank account. That means collection, that means taxes, that means organisation, it means institution. If you're going to obey the Bible and have elders who rule and who get double honour, then suddenly you've got a whole pile of stuff that goes with it. And I think you see this in Ephesus and Crete. Paul appoints and tells Timothy, it's very clear, guard the good deposit. Reject these people, they're unrepentant heretics. Include these people, they're repentant sinners. Build up these people. Teach these duties. Here's how young women are supposed to behave, and young men are supposed to behave, and older women are supposed to behave, and older men are supposed to behave, and here's what elders do, and here's what deacons do. And now, which is it? Is it Corinth or Ephesus? And the answer is everyone's somewhere on a spectrum here. And you can't be pure organism, and you mustn't be pure institution. And it's a wisdom that is brought to bear that will enable that sweet spot of organized organism, which is not just halfway, it sort of, I think, leans a little, leans deliberately towards organism, towards creativity and freedom, especially because we live in an increasingly regulated society. So in our society, with increasing regulation and governance, what that means is that our society has veered towards over-institutionalization. And if we're not careful, we'll just go there naturally. And so what I'm suggesting is that you can't and mustn't be either a pure organism, and you mustn't be a pure institution, but to retain some kind of elements of both in a way that enables movement dynamics to emerge. In a city context, that is going to be especially this kind of Catholicity of spirit. So I mentioned this before, and I wonder if there's a challenge that I can put to you here, which is to begin to reflect on your own context as to what expression Catholicity of spirit takes for you. So I mentioned this before, it takes a movement to reach a city, and no one church or denomination can be a movement. And so you must celebrate others. Just by the way, why can't any one denomination or church be a movement? Why is that the case? We're a people, not a tribe, and typically a church or a denomination will have kind of tribal elements to it. I think there's something in that. The reason I'd suggest is that there are different emphases available to you as a church, and I guess it's possible that our church or denomination will equally strongly emphasize each of the available emphases, although the danger then is you become the perfectly bland church. Right? You've ever taken paint from all the different colours and put it in one pot and mixed it up, you know what you get? Brown. Like really ugly, browny, grey nothingness. What you want is vibrancy of colour. And so there are churches that really emphasise a strong doctrinal stance and teaching ministry, and that's great. And then there are churches and movements that emphasise a white-hot evangelistic passion. And there are other churches that emphasise a profound experience of community. And other churches that emphasise a deep compassion for the poor and the marginalised. Other churches that are just enormously into worship. And it's possible that you're a church that's hugely intellectually and theologically engaged, and at the same time also profoundly moving into community, and have this awesome worship, and are also totally sold out onto compassion and mercy ministries, and I've even forgotten what the other one is, except it's unlikely that you're going to pull that off, isn't it? The church that you'll be part of will have strengths and gaps, and just actually as Paul says that no one person has all the spiritual gifts, it may be the case that it works to think about churches as gifted by God in particular ways, and that no one church has all the spiritual gifts. Why does God not give everyone all the spiritual gifts in the body of Christ? Do you know why that is? So we need each other. Why does God not give any one church or denomination all the spiritual gifts? So we need each other. And I'd just suggest that churches and denominations typically have certain strengths, and with strengths come weaknesses. That's just how life works. And therefore attract and release people who fit with those particular strengths and not with their gaps. And therefore It just is the case that no one church or denomination can be, is designed by God to be a movement all on its own. Because the city is full of people of every kind, of every temperament, of every capacity. There are just some people in New York City who will only go to a highly liturgical Episcopal church. And there's no point trying to be a highly liturgical Episcopal church if you're a Presbyterian church. It just doesn't work. So what do? You just say, who cares about Anglicans anyway? Which may be not such a bad thing to say, but there's an even better thing to say, which is, let's not just celebrate, let's actually help, resource a church that's not us to reach people that will never come here. So it takes a movement to reach a city. No one church or denomination can be a movement, and so we have to celebrate each other. And thirdly, it's Movement Day. We've just had Movement Day here in New Zealand, I think. That was the last couple of days. Movement Day added this third element that I've learned, which is that the pace of movement will rarely exceed the expressed unity of Christian leaders in the city. When Tim Keller was in Sydney, he said, he put out the challenge to spend 15% of your time outside of your tribe. That's obviously unrealistic, so let's ignore that. Why don't you start with 5% of your time? Half a day a fortnight, outside your tribe. You'll find that they don't have as many horns, and not as many of them have tails as you might think. So it takes a movement to reach a city. No one church or denomination can be a movement, and therefore we celebrate others, and that the pace of a movement will rarely exceed the expressed unity of Christian leaders in a city. And so when you have churches that have these movement dynamics in them, networks and churches that have movement dynamics in them, where they've managed this balance between organic and organization, so that they're an organized organism. The adjective is organized, the noun is organism. And that they lean towards freedom and creativity, even at the same time as knowing there have to be these organizational elements in place. So when churches and networks in an area have those kinds of dynamic characteristics about them, and they match that between each other with this kind of Catholicity of spirit, and then there is a stronger emergence of a gospel ecosystem, which is that outer circle in the diagram that Keller has. This is just put here in words now, which is reproducing churches, including planting and revitalization, specialized evangelism ministries, faith and work initiatives, and justice and mercy initiatives, with a variety of institutions that help support the church, like seminaries and schools, and leaders not being tribal, but be willing to come together, especially to pray together. There's just the possibility under God and by the power of his Holy Spirit that a movement of the gospel will emerge. Now, as I say, I live in Sydney, and so I've not seen a movement of the gospel in this way in any wide-scale sense. It's interesting, if you did the historic analysis of the Billy Graham crusade, I suspect that what you had happening then throughout the sort of second half of the decade, right from the middle of the 50s, as they began to prepare for Billy Graham to come, a lot of this was in place. And that's the last time we've had renewal, a movement of the gospel in Sydney, as far as I can tell. And the question I want to leave you with, I guess, the challenge is, what are some ways that you can, both in your own context, in the church where you're serving, but also between you and others, begin to live out some more of these movement dynamics in prayerful hope that God would do a fresh and powerful and substantial thing in a way that you may not have seen thus far. City tries to contribute to that. That's what we're about. Our vision statement is we help start movements of the gospel and so on and so on. Guna's mentioned the Intensive, which is this 2-week program where we bring church planters together. Because church planting, as we've talked about, is crucial for the kind of dynamics of movement in a context. We do, for that, there's this process of assessment to try and ensure that we don't send people onto roles that they can't fulfill. There's coaching that is available to ensure that we don't just train people and then send them out and say, see you, when you die, but actually are coaching people along the way. Training in the form of this incubator, as we've described it, which is a 2-year peer learning, adult learning oriented, practice change directed learning program, the incubator, and funding of church planting. And so if, Nigel said this already, if you think that City City could be of use to you here in bringing some of these resources to bear as you seek to be what God has called you to be, a movement, then do please feel free to be in touch. So I'm going to leave it there. I think that's enough for us all. Where the people are starting to leave. That's always a worry, isn't it, when people start leaving? I just want to say again on behalf of Gunnar and myself, just what a privilege it has been to be here. I've learned an enormous amount being here, just about the history of the gospel here in New Zealand. I'm incredibly encouraged to see the kind of diversity of people that we've been able to have in the room today. Today and yesterday, I want to thank you for coming. I hope that's been. I figure typically in a conference, if you take away one really specific, useful idea, then you've got your money's worth. Right? For me, one. I'm a little pessimistic. Maybe you were hoping for two. But I hope you've got at least one thing that you go away with. You know what? That is something I'm not going to just let be on my shelf. I'm not just going to put my notes in a folder and put them away somewhere. I'm actually going to do that. I'm going to act on it. It's going to change things around. And so I hope that that's been of some benefit to you. And if, in the Lord's good purposes, we get to journey together a little further down the track, then I'd love to do that. So with that, I'm going to say thank you, and the Lord's very great blessing to you.